US political figures are calling for attacks on Iran, but were there plans to attack Iran long before the terrorist attacks on Israel? And is this situation being further exploited by economically driven interests? Hello there, you Awakening Wonders. Thank you for joining us. Remember, we stream at these times every day and we value your support incredibly. It's so important that we do our best to remain beyond the all-encompassing fear that appears to be escalating along with violence across the world in this time of omni-crisis. If you haven't downloaded the Rumble app yet, download the Rumble app now and follow us there. And if it's within your means, become an Awakened Wonder. Support our content. We make a lot of additional stuff and we need your support now more than ever. We've been talking a lot about the exploitation of escalating tensions in the Middle East, how people in Congress are purchasing stocks and shares in weapons companies that are set to benefit from this increasing conflagration. Of course, we are mindful to stand well away from those of you that are personally affected either ideologically or religiously by this horrific situation and focus instead on those that may be seeking to exploit this conflict in exactly the same way that they've exploited other conflicts in recent years and even contemporaneously exploited the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. In fact, in some cases, these conflicts are being bound together as a kind of one-size-fits-all military opportunity. Calls for attacking Iran remain interesting as it's been a long-standing policy within US military-industrial complex and neocon circles to increase, escalate and ignite tensions and even war with Iran. First, it was discussed as part of the new American century. Countries like Syria, Iraq and Iran significantly were nominated as potential opponents for America for forthcoming wars. We'll be talking about that. And I'd almost forgotten, had you, that when Donald Trump had those confidential documents when he left office, significantly, some of the documentation in those boxes was plans for an attack or war with Iran. So we're asking, is this situation tragic and inconceivable, though it might seem to rational and awakening people like you, being used to create opportunities to attack enemies for reasons beyond this current crisis? Firstly, let's have a look at Lindsey Graham, who, as you know, is an ardent advocate for ongoing war between Ukraine and Russia, always suggesting further military packages that would ultimately benefit Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. Let's see how he is binding together the Ukraine-Russia conflict and this conflict and advocating openly for attacks, interestingly, on Iranian oil refineries. Just let me know if you think that this rhetoric is about humanitarian support for a country that's recently experienced an egregious terrorist attack, or could there be other motivation potentially connected to preceding plans, which we'll discuss in more details going forward? Let me know what you think in the chat.
Well, for every Israeli or American hostage executed by Hamas, we should take down an Iranian oil refinery. We're going to blow up your oil refineries and put you out of business.
Have you noticed that Lindsey Graham's nomenclature, his linguistic set, is all about economics and business? Put them out of business. Plainly, the language around attacking Iran was economically undergirded. When he speaks about Ukraine, Russia, it's very much couched in business terms. He is very pro the perpetuation of this conflict.
Here's what we've gotten for our investment. We haven't lost one soldier. We reduced the combat power of the Russian army by 50%, and not one of us has died in that endeavor. This is a great deal for America.
Doesn't that seem to be an unusual type of language to deploy when discussing an event that, however you perceive it, leads to death and destruction and sadness, has already caused immeasurable, almost unimaginable, except for those of you that are forced to be confronted by it because of proximity or because it's something that involves you, suffering and sadness, to see it spoken of in economic terms, doesn't that seem odd to you and worthy of further consideration?
You've previously said that it's the best money we've ever spent. That's still true?
Since we helped Churchill stand up to the Nazis.
Let's have a look at Vivek Ramaswamy advocating for restraint on Stephen Crowder's Rumble show.
If I'm talking to Bibi, I would say, listen up, we got your back. Don't let anybody stand in your way from defending yourself, and we've got your back on that. But my advice to you would be that we've made some of our poorest decisions in the wake of real disaster. That was your 9/11. We had our 9/11 here. And we entered disastrous multi-decade commitments in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And 20 years later, it did not do us an iota of good.
The understandable grief of anger of people directly affected is not what we are commenting on here. What we are talking about is this situation being exploited, and was there a pre-existing agenda when it comes to Iran as part of America's military-industrial complex-oriented foreign policy? Let's have a look at what Tucker Carlson had to say about neocons advocating for war, and indeed his potential suspicion that there are motivations beyond support and solidarity.
What exactly would happen to the United States if we declared war on Iran and started blowing up their infrastructure? Lindsey Graham has no clue what would happen. He hasn't thought it through. He's almost 70 years old and he has no children. He doesn't care. But neither, amazingly, do most of his colleagues in Washington. They're as reckless as he is. Texas Congressman Dan Crenshaw took to social media to call for what he described as a war to end all wars, as if there is such a thing.
We're not talking about this conflict and the understandable anger and rage that people that are directly involved must feel at this time. We are asking, is this situation being exploited? And has there been a long-standing agenda to engage Iran in conflict? For example, Trump's confidential documents are said to have contained plans to attack Iran. Let's revisit that. The issue stemmed from Trump's apparent frustration with what he claimed was a false narrative being pushed by the press that after losing the 2020 election, under the advice of the coterie of Iran hawks he'd surrounded himself with, Trump was dangerously close to ordering strikes on Iran that could have triggered full-scale war and had to be talked down from it by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley. But the former president maintained the reality of the situation was the exact opposite, that it was Milley and the Pentagon who were pushing for an attack on Iran on a reluctant Trump, and that the classified documents he had kept were proof of this. It's interesting to reflect on that story about a potential agenda. We're speaking again about the United States of America, not Israel, when it comes to Iran and foreign policy. Very curious. And indeed, how old are these ideas, and what is the history of agitation, in particular between the United States and their military-industrial complex partners and Iran? Of course, I'm talking about the project for the new American century. Let me know in the chat and the comments if you're familiar with that phrase. Years ago, there was a plan, a clean break, project for the new American century, PNAC, to wreck the Oslo peace accords between Israel and the Palestinians and to remold the Middle East. It first involved destroying Iraq, or in the discredited words of Paul Wolfowitz, the road to peace in the Middle East goes through Baghdad. Destroying Syria was to be next, and then Iran. This is sensitive content at a difficult time, and you know we cannot make it without your ongoing support, and we thank you for that support. We also need our commercial partners who have been fantastic during this time. This, I think, is a product you're going to be interested in. Cell phones can go down for hundreds of reasons, you know that, but satellite phones, they're always going to work because you're carrying your own personal cell tower with you everywhere you go. You can prepare for the unexpected with one of these little guys. Anyone with a satellite phone, for example, in the midst of that Burning Man thing, you know, they were cut off, they were lost in a desert, they would have had a way to communicate with friends, family, and emergency services. Are you a prepper? Are you prepping right now? You better get prepping. This would be the prepper's friend because you can't be tracked. No one can listen to your calls. If you have a satellite phone and the person you're chatting to has got a satellite phone, that's the most secure form of communication there is. The US military uses sat phones for secured communication. It's not double encrypted, but as Edward Snowden's told us, there's 1,000 ways they can ignore it. So if you care about communicating privately and having the ability to communicate, particularly in a fast-changing world, visit sat123.com or call 866-643-0609 and use the promo code BRAND50 to waive the $50 activation fee. You can get rid of that by using the code BRAND50. This service is only applicable, sadly, to those of you in the USA. So whilst there may be corruption all over your country, you do have the advantage of being able to get one of these phones and bypass at least some of the surveillance. So please visit sat123.com or call 866-643-0609 using the code BRAND50 to waive the $50 activation fee. I've never wanted to be in your sweet nation more. Hello? Oh no, It's still okay, very durable as well. So let's get back to this complex piece of content in the midst of the Omni crisis in a difficult time. In 2006, columnist Taki Theodorakopoulos warned in the American Conservative of the clean break plan to aggressively remake the strategic environments of Iraq, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and Iran. So when there are so many complex aspects of this war, it's worth tracking the observable trend towards potential profiteering and other agenda. People in Congress purchasing stocks and shares in weapons manufacturers. Have a look at this on X from Unusual Wales. And this ongoing narrative around attacking Iran. Curious. So what are the potential consequences for any US involvement in a potential war with Iran and escalating a regionalized conflagration, tragic, awful though that is in itself, into something that has potential global connotations and fits into the narrative of forever wars that we've been discussing since the conflict between Ukraine and Russia escalated, and the potential even for a war with China around the issue of Taiwan. Is this potentially a component of that? Let me know in the chat in the comments what you think. These calls for attacking Iran risk an escalation that could entrench the US in another forever war. Nearly 20 years after the invasion of Iraq, it is commonly understood as a historic mistake of US foreign policy. The push for another disastrous war in the Middle East appears to be the real intention of hawkish voices. That's what we're asking. What is the real intention? Is it support and solidarity, or is it exploitation? Witnessing the death and devastation in Ukraine and concerns over nuclear escalation with Russia, it is all the more crucial to weigh the consequences of war. This is not to mention the global impact of such conflicts, as can be seen in rising food and energy costs, a looming global food crisis that will starve many already facing food insecurity around the world, and inflation in the United States that is heavily impacting the lives of American workers. It's difficult to make such arguments from the perspective of people directly affected by this terrible conflict, but when it comes to US involvement and the potential motivation behind the advocacy of many of these plainly hawkish figures is something that is worth keeping an eye on, would you agree? A war with Iran will likely worsen these conditions, especially the flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz in the Gulf. In fact, American public opinion is against more wars, which is why both the Biden and Trump administrations promised to end endless war, in what has become a popular catchphrase in US political discourse. It's curious to watch Biden claiming that he advocates for global peace and will do anything he can, and the reason he should run as president in 2024 is because imagine we could bring about world peace, bring a peaceful conclusion to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and bring about peace in the Middle East. It doesn't seem that the actions, policy, and funding, broadly speaking, are heading in the direction of peace or ending endless wars, does it? And I suppose such promises have to be taken in light of the fact that America is the largest military supplier in the world, providing weaponry for over 50% of the world's autocratic nations. Weapons that could, and some argue have, ended up in the hands of terror organizations and drug cartels. Even in a war effort that Americans support, like Ukraine, the majority do not want the US to risk war with Russia. And it appears that opinion is changing on that issue. Is that why, do you imagine, that the current conflict in the Middle East is being bundled together with that less popular conflict, which is less popular not because of humanitarian reasons, not because of a lack of compassion, but the observable evidence that the approach is not working, that the counter-offensive failed, that many people are beginning to question what the motivations for funding that war are, and many people are also questioning how that war began. This is not surprising, given the failures of US militarism, most notably the swift takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban after 20 years of war, and the enormous cost of these conflicts to American taxpayers as many struggle at home. Julian Assange famously said that you understand why the Afghanistan war went on for so long when you recognise that it wasn't a war that they wanted to end, it was a war that they wanted to sustain, and that the function of such wars is to take money from public hands and to put them into the hands of private companies. And we can see that trillions has subsequently gone from American taxpayers' pockets into the military-industrial complex. This is not about supporting the troops or ensuring that the American military are well supported as they conduct selfless, dangerous, potentially lethal work on the behalf of patriotism, but ultimately ends up being profitable to military-industrial complex partners of the Pentagon who notably cannot pass an audit. That means it's not possible for them to account for their expenditure or their profiting. And as you know, some people have contested that up to 70% of weaponry intended for Ukraine ended up elsewhere. A war with Iran, a country with a larger population than Iraq and Afghanistan combined, and a stronger position in the region in the wake of US wars would be another historic blunder with far worse outcomes than we have already seen. No sensible person would comment on Israel's position and potential appetite for ongoing conflict after these horrific attacks. It would seem insensitive to do so, but US involvement in a war with Iran and escalation of these tensions has to be scrutinized, and in particular, the motivations would have to be understood. You'd have to be certain that the motivation was humanitarianism, solidarity, righteousness, and if there were questions about those motivations, it would certainly be prudent, I would think, to ask them. Any such war would be a calamity, further destabilizing oil prices and adding to the economic havoc from the war in Ukraine that's already caused much secondary human suffering, while potentially creating the conditions for a much bigger and more dangerous confrontation. Iran's deepening alliance with Russia, after all, could draw Moscow into the war, turning the country into the second front of a global proxy battle between two nuclear superpowers, the United States and Russia. These certainly seem like considerations that are worth discussing and understanding. That's why I think the rhetoric of politicians like Lindsey Graham and Nikki Haley has to be scrutinised. As I understand, these are not people that are personally affected by a horrific conflict. They are people that potentially have motivations beyond the deep grief and suffering that region is defined by. Knowing what we know about the agenda of many people in Congress right now, their investment in stocks and shares that will benefit from escalating wars, and knowledge that war with Iran appears to have been part of an agenda in the United States neocon circles for some time, it seems to me that circumspection and awareness for those of us that are not directly involved in this horrific conflict is a necessity. There is a real distinction between what people of Israel are having to confront and face right now and the potential decisions made by people who appear to talk about this in purely economic terms. And whilst economy continues to be a consideration when geopolitical resource-based wars continue to escalate potentially on numerous fronts, for many of us it would seem that other considerations ought be brought to the forefront. In short, can we trust the rhetoric of many of these US politicians whose motivations may not be entirely clear? What is the best way for us as a global community to support the people most directly affected by this escalating conflict? Certainly, the ongoing attempt to put the Russia-Ukraine war, the China-US conflict, and current Middle Eastern matters into one economic bundle when it comes to military aid and foreign policy decisions appears to be irresponsible when there are so many distinct, discrete, and difficult considerations to be undertaken. But that's just what I think. Why don't you let me know what you think in the chat? Remember, we stream every day at these times. You can join us there. And if it's within your means, become an Awakened Wonder and gain access to a lot more content. But remember, your support is much more important to us than anything else, and we want you to remain with us, and we thank you for staying with us so far. More important than any of that is if you can, please stay free.